Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us at the Kenner Lecture. Really quickly, before we begin, if you could please silence your cell phones. Also, I just wanted to let you know there will be at least 40 minutes for Q&A at the end of the lecture. It is my honor to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Professor Joseph S. Nye, Jr., and he will be talking about the question, is the American century over? This is also the title of his newest book. A distinguished service professor at Harvard University, Professor Nye previously served as the dean of the Kennedy School of Government. In addition, he has served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for IR Security Affairs, Chair of the National Intelligence Council, and Deputy Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance, Science, and Technology. He's the author of several books which focus on leadership and soft power. In 2011, Foreign Policy named Dean Nye one of their top 100 global thinkers. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nye.
Thank you very much for a kind introduction. When we were chatting a minute or two ago, I was asked, what title do you want, dean or professor? And I said either one was fine, but the one thing I'm glad we didn't use was doctor, because when my sons were growing up and people would call the house and they'd say, is Dr. Nye there? They'd always say, yes, but he's not the useful kind. So, but it's a pleasure to have a chance to give a lecture named in honor of Madeleine Albright. I worked with Madeleine in the Carter administration and in the Clinton administration, and have great affection for her and great admiration for her. And she's obviously a terrific role model for all Wellesley students, but for all of us as well. So it's a real pleasure to have this chance to do that. What I'd like to talk to you about a little bit today is this question of what's going to happen to the United States in terms of its position in the world. And some people say that the 21st century is going to be the Chinese century. Some people say that the United States is in decline. There's a great deal of back and forth on this. And the process of thinking about this, I was wondering about a proclamation that was first made by the publisher Henry Luce, who in 1941 was the editor of Time and Life magazine. And Luce coined a term and wrote an essay that became quite famous called The American Century. And this was in early 1941. And the reason he did it was not because there was an American century, but because there wasn't. If you look at what happened to the United States, it became the world's largest economy and the most powerful country after World War I. But then, instead of ratifying the League of Nations and joining and providing public goods, it turned inward. And in the 1920s and 30s, the U.S., particularly in the 30s, turned to isolationism, which allowed Hitler to rise in Europe and was a huge catastrophe. And so Luce, in 1941, said the Americans basically had not lived up to their responsibilities after World War I, and he urged the United States to get involved in World War II. But he wasn't very successful. He coined this term, the American century, as his effort to get the United States into the war. But in fact, neither Luce nor Franklin Roosevelt, who was president at the time, were very successful in persuading the Americans to play a major role in terms of the global balance of power. In fact, Roosevelt gave several speeches warning of the dangers that Hitler represented and the problems with the rise of Hitler, but he was unable to persuade the American people. At one point, after he'd given a speech trying to suggest that we should do more internationally in the face of this domestic isolationism, he turned to his speechwriter and he said, "What does a leader in a democracy do when you go in one direction and you look over your shoulder and nobody is following. So that one of the greatest orators we had as a president was unable to persuade the American people. In fact, the reason the United States got into World War II was not because of Luce with his writing or Roosevelt with his speaking, but because of Japan. It's the attack on Pearl Harbor, and because Hitler made the mistake of backing up his Japanese ally in the Axis and attacking, after the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the United States. So that's a little lesson of how the American century started. Didn't start on purpose, almost the opposite. But if you take Luce's comment of an American century, it's interesting to guess what will happen after 100 years. What will the world look like in 2041? Will the Americans still be central to the global balance of power, or will they be, in fact, less important? Will they turn inward? Will they be overtaken by China? There are a number of open questions here. And it's interesting to look at this period and to realize that nobody has a very clear idea of what the century would look like. And for one thing, it's somewhat arbitrary to talk about centuries. When you look at the life cycle of a country, it's very different from the life cycle of an individual. As human organisms, we know that we are roughly 70 years and 10, but maybe sometimes we get 50 years, and that's probably about it. With a country, you don't know that at all. For example, in the 18th century, after Britain lost its North American colonies, Horace Walpole, British statesman at the time, said, "Woe is Britain, we have just lost our position in the world and we're reduced to a miserable little island like Sardinia." He said this on the eve of Britain's second century, of the 19th century, which was fueled by the Industrial Revolution, in which Britain was even more powerful. So when we speculate about these things, we have to be careful not to take a term like a century too seriously. Luce was using this term basically for propagandistic purposes. We also have to be careful not to think that countries, which are constructs, social constructs, are like human bodies or organisms. They're not. So we have a certain problem of thinking about this, but if we are clear about our metaphors and seeing their limits, then we don't have to fall into some of the traps of the past. There's also the question of whether the United States is in decline. There's a long tradition of Americans thinking that we're in decline. And in the period after the Great Recession of 2008, there was a widespread view that the United States was in decline. When you look at public opinion polls, that was widely shared. But what's interesting is the Americans have always worried about decline. They start worrying about decline right at the beginning. The founding Puritans who started, 20 miles to the east of here, were breaking away from the established church in England to set up something they thought was going to be a new way of worshiping, getting closer to God. And as they set up this new covenant, this new land, they worried that they weren't going to be worthy, that they weren't going to live up to this. So while they'd broken away from the Church of England because they were going to be more pure, when they got over here and thought about it, they weren't sure that they were pure enough. So right at the beginning, you have a concern about decline. And the founding fathers, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and others, were also worried about decline. For them, the decline, they started a new republic, breaking away from monarchy, but their fear was that they were going to lose the republican virtues, that they would go the way of Rome and essentially become an autocracy. So the founding fathers were constantly looking back at the Roman Republic and worrying about American decline. And Charles Dickens, the great British novelist, when he came to visit the United States in the 19th century, basically said, these Americans are very strange. They always think of doom and gloom, and they're always in some sort of crisis or another. So we have a tradition of this sort, and it's been reinforced in the 20th century by a series of periods in which the United States has thought that it was in decline. One example is after the Soviet Union put up the Sputnik satellite in 1957, the United States felt that this meant the Soviets were ahead. And there was a wave of what my colleague Sam Huntington once called declinism, feeling that we were on the way out. Of course, that didn't turn out to be true. It was the Soviet Union that was on the way out, but the polls will show you that that period there was a feeling that the United States was in decline. Similarly, when Japanese manufacturing proved superior to American manufacturing in the 1980s, there was another wave of declinism, and colleagues published books like Japan is Number One, or the president of Stratfor, a consulting company, talked about the coming war with Japan. Of course, that didn't turn out to be the case either. And since, as I mentioned earlier, since the Great Recession of 2008, which was caused in part by poor financial management in the United States, there was a feeling that the Chinese were now passing us, and the Chinese were 10 feet tall, and this wave of declinism is just one of many that we've seen over time. So what's the truth about decline? Because these various polls tell you something about American psychology. They don't tell you much about reality of how the world is structured in terms of power. If you think about decline and you try to get away from the current popular fads and opinions, you need to distinguish two meanings of the term. One is decline in absolute, and the other is in relative terms. Absolute decline is what happened to ancient Rome. Rome wasn't passed by another empire or another rising power. Rome succumbed to attacks by barbarians and unable to defend itself. And the reason is that there was no growth in productivity in the Roman economy, and the Romans succumbed to internecine warfare, a series of civil wars. So Rome, though it took 300 years to go from the peak of Roman power to the decline of the Western Roman Empire, nonetheless it was not by growth of another empire. It was essentially absolute decline and in terms of internal decay. Now, sometimes people will look at the problems in Washington now and say, we are like Rome. We're going through the same thing. If you look at the political gridlock, or you look at the riots that we're seeing in Baltimore or earlier in Ferguson and so forth, this is a sign of the decay that was typical of Rome. But actually, that's the kind of sentence that often makes a good first sentence for an editorial or an op-ed or something where you want to catch attention, but it doesn't fit the facts very well. If you look at the United States and comparison Rome, it's hard to make the case for absolute decline. Look at demography. In demography, the United States is the only major rich country or developed country which will keep its relative status in 2050. So if the UN demographers who project trends in population say that the world today, the ranking of countries is China first, India second, the United States third. By 2050, it'll be India first, China second, but the US will still be third, which is quite remarkable because countries like Russia or Europe or Japan are all going to suffer major reductions in their populations. And the United States is different because it accepts immigration. The fact that the natality rate is a little bit higher, but also primarily because we are a nation of immigrants, means the U.S. is likely to maintain its ranking. The second thing that you can point to as to why the U.S. isn't undergoing absolute decline is the changes that have occurred over the last 5 or 6 years in energy. 7 or 8 years ago, if you were talking about the United States' position in the world, you said, U.S. is becoming hopelessly dependent on imported energy, and there's nothing that can be done about it. All the experts projected this, getting more and more dependent. Now the International Energy Agency in Paris projects that in the 2020s, North America may not import any energy. What a change. It's a change brought on by what's called the shale revolution, the combination of the technologies of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, which has unlocked oil and gas, which was there all the time, but nobody thought could be developed. But it makes a huge difference in terms of America's position. A third thing you can point to that would make us not look like Rome or not be a case of absolute decline is to look at the technologies that are going to be crucial in terms of the development of this 21st century. If you look at biotechnology, nanotechnology, the next wave of information technology, it's generally agreed that the United States is in the forefront of all of these. And behind that is a fourth point, which is if you look at U.S. universities, if you look at the ranking of universities carried out by the Chinese Shanghai Jiaotong University, 15 of the top 20 universities are American. You combine that with deep capital markets and an entrepreneurial culture, and you realize that these comparisons of ancient Rome just don't make sense. Yes, we have problems. Ferguson, Baltimore are real problems. Political gridlock is a problem. Frankly, I would put K to 12 education on that list. There are lots of things that are major problems. But to say that this is like ancient Rome with no productivity in the economy and internecine warfare is, I think, stretching a historical analogy. I think if we're going to look at the question of decline, more interesting is a question not of absolute decline, but of relative decline. What will be the U.S. share compared to the rest of the world? And in absolute relative decline, what's interesting is that the United States starts the 20th century with about a quarter of the world's economy. It goes up to about half the world's economy after World War II because everybody is laid low by the war except the U.S., which is strengthened by it. And by the end of the 20th century, we go back down to about 23% of the world economy. And it's generally projected by the International Monetary Fund and others that in the 2020s we may be something like 18% of the world economy. So you could argue that that's relative decline. You could also call it the rise of the rest. It's the increased success of economies like China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, and others, which essentially means that the American share of world product is not as high as it once was. We're doing well, but others doing well and growing even faster. So that raises questions of how the United States will be able to get work done, or another way of putting it is if the principal entropy is the loss of the ability to get work done, is the bigger threat that we face not that they will be passed by China or another country, but that we will not be able to get work done, that entropy is a bigger challenge than China. I happen to think that that's likely to be the case, but there are many people who in fact say, no, you're hiding from the fact that China is about to pass the United States and that this is the bigger problem. So let's look at that in more detail. The question of whether China will pass the United States in overall power. And you want to set some time limit on any proposition like this if it's to be useful. So we'll use Henry Luce's 2041 as 100 years after his statement. I think that China probably will not pass the United States in overall power by 2041. But you might say, how can I say such a thing when it's clear that the opposite is true? For example, the Financial Times, which is a very respected British newspaper, a year ago this month, had a headline saying, Chinese economy now larger than the American economy. But when you looked at that more carefully, you saw that they were using a comparison in what's called purchasing power parity, which is an adjustment that economists make when they want to compare welfare in two societies. But if you look at exchange rates, which is what you have to use when you buy oil or jet engines or whatever, then the U.S. is still ahead. But even if you get away from purchasing power parity and focus on exchange rates, the United States, it's argued, will be a smaller economy than China's sometime in the 2020s. When the U.S. was growing not at all, and China was growing by 10% as a result of a massive stimulus package after the recession, the Economist and others used to have on Economist magazine and others used to have a little betting game as to when would China pass the U.S., measured properly in exchange rates. And they got it down to as early as 2018 or 2019. Now, with the Americans growing more rapidly and the Chinese economy slowing down somewhat, people are saying, well, it looks like more like the late 2020s, maybe 2030. There are still some economists who think it would be later than that. But let's posit that at some point, with 1.3 billion people, an economy that is growing at some rate that's higher than the American rate, that China will have a larger economy overall. Question is, does that mean they're economically more powerful? Well, not necessarily. In fact, if you look at the measures of economic power, having a large market is one. It allows you to essentially control access to your market, also to generate wealth which you can plow into military or other expenditures. So it is a major source of power. But it doesn't tell you much about the sophistication of an economy. Per capita income gives you a better measure of the sophistication of an economy. And that's important because sometimes the large picture of how big is the economy doesn't tell you how strong the economy is and what it can do. For example, if you take out your iPhone and you say, this costs about, $750 in the United States, something like that. But it comes from China. This is an import from China. And then you say, well, okay, that means that China, when the trade statistics say that it passed Germany as the world's largest trading country in 2012, that China is the trading superpower. But not quite right, if you think in terms of sophistication of an economy. The Chinese actually get about 5% of the value added. A lot of this iPhone value added comes from components which come from different countries, Malaysia, Singapore, wherever, and on the input side, and a lot of it comes from the intellectual property rights and the marketing on the American side. So China, the trade statistics show this as a Chinese export, but actually most of the value goes outside of China. Or another way of thinking of that is the phrase that I use in the book, which is that the Chinese themselves complain that they're good at producing jobs, but not Steve Jobs. And so as the economy develops, China will innovate and do more. But at this stage, when we just look at the kinds of headlines that show that China is bigger than the United States somewhere in the late 2020s, we're missing something, which is at that point, let's call it 2030, when the Chinese economy is larger than the American economy. The American economy will still be considerably larger than China's in per capita income. So as we look at measures and efforts to try to compare economic power, we want to be careful not to oversimplify. There's also the question of what's going to happen to China. I've stressed that China that grows at what they now call the new normal, which is 7%. But China faces a number of challenges as to whether it will be able to keep its growth at that rate. My colleagues Larry Summers and Lant Pritchett at the Kennedy School have done a study of other countries which have grown very rapidly in the past and asked how long does it take before they return to normal, so to speak, or back to average, or regression to the mean. And their estimate is that if you didn't even know the word China or the name of the country, it was just country X, and you looked at past performance of other high growth rate countries, Japan, for example, once grew over 10% a year, you would expect China's growth rate in the 2020s to be about 3.9%. So the new normal, which Li Keqiang, the Chinese Prime Minister, has announced as 7%, may turn out to be less than that. And obviously that gives you different views of what will happen. In addition to that, China faces a question of demography. You're seeing the shape of the Chinese population because of the one-child policy is going to have a lot more old people and not as many young people to support the old people. The Chinese call this getting old before you get rich. And it also faces a problem of sometimes called the middle income trap, which is the growth model that's been so successful so far, which has been labor intensive, you may have trouble adjusting to an internal innovation which can escape the problems that some other countries have faced when they reach around $10,000 per capita income. And the third thing they face is a political problem, which is what we know is that when countries reach about $8,000 to $10,000 per capita income, there's a greater demand for participation. And that demand for participation doesn't mean democracy per se, but it does mean that you have a problem which you can't rule a populace the same way at that level of income as you can when they are poor peasants. It's interesting if you compare China and India on this. India is behind China in per capita income, but it's also true that India has already solved that political participation problem. It was born that way. It inherited a constitutional structure which allowed for participation. China hasn't figured out how to solve that. The Communist Party tries to keep control, but it's very hard to see how they're going to do this as China develops. I happen to be relatively optimistic that China will solve these problems. I'm not a skeptic about China's future, but the argument that China will go on as it has now and that there'll be no problems, I think is probably too simple a view. In addition to the questions of how you make comparisons of economic power, there's also the question of military power. And in military power, the United States spends about 4 times what China spends. Now, China has been increasing its military budget by over 10% a year for more than a decade. And at some point, it'll get closer to the U.S. in military power, but very unlikely within the period that we're talking about that it'll be close enough to be a global military challenger. It probably will have a greater capacity to challenge the United States in the seas off the coast of China, but it's very unlikely to be a global military power in that time horizon. And finally, there's a third dimension of power that I've called soft power. If power is the ability to affect others to get what you want, you can do it through coercion or payment, military and economic power. You can also do it through attraction and persuasion, which I call soft power. And China has been making major efforts to increase its soft power. In 2007, President Hu Jintao said that China needed to invest heavily in soft power. If you think about that, that's very smart, because any country whose military and economic power is growing very rapidly scares its neighbors, and the neighbors are then tempted to want to form coalitions to protect themselves against the rising power. But if you can, at the same time as your hard power grows, if you can increase your soft power of attractiveness, you're less likely to see these coalitions form against you, or that they will less likely to be as effective as they might be. So when Hu Jintao, and it's been repeated by current President Xi Jinping, said that China needed to invest heavily in soft power, it led to spending billions and billions of dollars on things like Confucius Institutes and turning Chinese Central Television into a 24/7 cable news and so forth. But the polls show that China has not had a lot of success with this soft power. particularly in its own neighborhood. And one of the reasons is that it is claiming territories from many of its neighbors, or territories that many of its neighbors also claim. And this means that when you set up a Confucius Institute in Manila, in the Philippines, to make yourself attractive, and at the same time you send your naval ships to chase the Philippine fishing boats out of an area like Scarborough Shoal, which is a reef within the Philippines exclusive economic zone, but the China says has been its area historically, the efforts to create soft power through a Confucius Institute don't work very well. And similarly, another problem that China has, and why its soft power is not as great in Europe or North America as it might otherwise be, is the unwillingness of China to unleash its civil society. If you look at much of American soft power or Indian soft power, it comes not from the statements of the government or actions of the government. It comes from everything like Hollywood or Bollywood to universities. It's things that grow out of civil society. For China, the Communist Party wants to control these things. There are censors. There are limits to what can be expressed. And the net effect of this is it undercuts China's efforts to increase its soft power. The net effect of this is, if you look at all three dimensions of power, economic, military, and soft power, is I don't think that China will be more powerful than the US in 2040s. Now, why does this matter? Is it merely a matter of national pride, of being able to say we're number one? No, it doesn't. It has a deeper root or deeper significance than that. And the deeper significance goes to two things. One is that if you have a situation where you have an established power and a rising power, and the rising power creates fear in the established power, you have the basis for great conflict. Those of you who have taken or read your Thucydides in a course here at Wellesley will remember that if you ask how did Thucydides explain the origins of the Peloponnesian War, in which the Greek city-state system tore itself apart in the 5th century BC, you'll see that he said the cause was the rise in the power of Athens and the fear it created in Sparta. And similarly, many people say that the World War I, in which the European state system tore itself apart a century ago, was caused by the rise in the power of Germany and the fear that created in Britain. That's a bit of an oversimplification of the causes of World War I, but nonetheless there's something in it, that periods where you have a rising power creating fear in an established power are periods which can be very volatile and can give rise to great conflicts, which can be highly disruptive for the world. So it does matter if we have a clear idea of whether China is about to pass the US. What's worth noticing about Britain and Germany a century ago was that Britain had already been passed by Germany in industrial production by 1900. If you believe what I say this afternoon, but more importantly, the facts and figures that are in the book that support it, China's not about to pass the US in overall power. That means the US has time to deal with China and to work with China and not to give rise to fears about China. No, there's no need to let this collapse into a fatalistic or inevitable view of a conflict between the US and China. There are some Americans do so. John Mearsheimer, a political scientist at the University of Chicago, has said that China cannot rise peacefully. If that's true, we're going to have a lot of trouble in the world. I think he's wrong. And I think he's wrong for the reasons that I've just said. The other reason why it matters is if you look at the question of providing global public goods, for example, the ability to maintain international monetary stability, which is good for everybody, or deal with climate change, which if we deal with it, could be good for everybody, depends on being able to have a large country take the lead in producing global goods. The reason is that for a very small country, it just doesn't pay. If you're Burundi or Ghana, and you are saying, should I pay a lot to stop climate change or a lot for international monetary stability? The answer is no. It doesn't matter much what you do. You're too small to have an effect. But if you have a large country like the United States or China, you can see the effects of your actions, and you can't afford to be a free rider. So for the United States and China to work cooperatively on some of these issues of providing global public goods is also going to be crucial to developing cooperation that we need to deal with the big challenges that we're going to face in this century. So having a clear idea of what the relationship is between China and the U.S. strikes me as important, both for avoiding a catastrophic war, but also important for our cooperating and dealing with some of the challenges that are, I call the transnational challenges of the 21st century. And in that sense, I think the news that is in this book is that the American century is not over, but it's going to be very different than it was when Henry Luce first proclaimed it. It's going to require the United States to work much more closely with a lot of countries, including China, India, and others, if we're going to be able to have a peaceful world which deals with many of these transnational challenges. So I don't see it as a Chinese century. I don't see the American century as over, but I do see a situation where the United States is going to have to adapt to a very different world, which is marked by the rise of the rest, not one of absolute decline, but one in which we're going to have to learn to work more effectively with others. So that's the message of Is the American Century Over? And that gives us half an hour left for your questions or objections, which are often even more fun than interesting. So over to you.
Anyone have a question?
Hi, Dr. Nai. My name is Wen Yan in the class of 2015. My question is that Charles Kindleberger, in his book, argued that we need a worldwide hegemon to maintain monetary stability and generally economic stability. So given that the US, it's still a great power, but I don't think it's a hegemon anymore in a lot of measures. Do you think that will be an issue, what Kindleberger said about Great Britain declining and the US not willing to take that role?
Well, it's a good question, and I was a great admirer of Charlie Kindleberger's. But I think he oversimplified in a couple of ways. What he was right is when the United States passed Britain at the end of World War I, we didn't do what we needed to do to maintain international monetary stability, an open international trading system, and so forth. But you don't have to necessarily be a hegemon to do that. It's also very unclear what a hegemon is. What I did was say a little bit about this when I talked about global public goods, that you need a large country which can see the results on itself of its actions to organize for global public goods. It doesn't have to be hegemonic in the sense of controlling everybody else. So I think in that sense, Charlie Kindleberger placed too much emphasis on or I would say exaggerated what it meant to be a hegemon. It's also true that there's a lot of myth about hegemony. The United States was never that much in control. At the period when we had nearly half of the world's economy, right after World War II, we were unable to prevent the Communist Party taking over in China. We were unable to prevent Stalin from getting a nuclear weapon. We were unable a few years later to prevent the Soviet invasion of Hungary. We were unable to prevent the French being defeated at Dien Bien Phu. So, if that's a hegemon, it's not very hegemonic. So I have a phrase in the book in which I say, hegemony ain't what it used to be, but then it never was. So the basic insight that Kindleberger was getting after, which is in collective goods theory that if you don't have a large consumer of collective goods helping to produce it, it'll be underproduced. That's correct. But the term hegemon, I think, exaggerates by oversimplifying history. Yes? Wait.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak with us today. I thoroughly enjoyed the lecture. My name is Jessica, and I'm a class of 2018er. And I just had a quick question. When you were talking about like the established power versus in the conflicts between the rising power, you kind of see there's also like ideological differences between the two nations. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were about between China and the United States, especially because China is a rising power and they do have a different political ideology, how that could translate into some sort of international conflict.
Well, it's possible. After all, when we look at the history of the Cold War, the communist ideology of Soviet Russia did create a great sense of threat. And if you look back to the 1930s and the rise of fascism, the ideology of fascism created a sense of threat. I don't see an ideology like that in China. China basically wants to get rich. I mean, when I go to China and talk to my Chinese friends, they're always complaining about we don't have an ideology anymore. That the Chinese Communist Party is based, its legitimacy is based not on Marxism, but on high growth rate and nationalism. So I don't see that China represents a threat. Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Russia, they posed an existential threat to us. China doesn't pose an existential threat to us. Now that doesn't mean you couldn't wind up in a war. I mean, you can have miscalculations. You can start with something like an issue in the South China Sea or the East China Sea. You can do dumb things, but there's no reason for the United States and China to go to war with each other. It's not, if in one sense, we're more of a problem for China than they are for us. I mean, the Chinese keep complaining that we're trying to make them be liberal and democratic, and Xi Jinping has said that we won't accept these Western ideas. But we can't change China. I mean, China will change itself, and the idea that we're going to sort of really change the Chinese regime is not a real threat to them. And similarly, the Chinese are not posing a direct threat to us. So I think yes, there are ideological differences, but I don't see them at all like the past differences that led to World War II or the Cold War. Yes, in the back.
Thanks so much for your lecture. I was wondering what you think about sort of the rise of anti-American sentiment in the Arab world, especially given the spread of Islamic extremism and what that does to United States influence in the world.
Well, I think it helps to differentiate different regions. And I think it's accurate to say that American power and influence in the Middle East has declined. We don't have the same sort of role that we had before. And but nobody does. I think that as I look at the Middle East, I see a region which had arrested development. If you read the Arab Human Development Report, which was written by Arabs for the UN, they show that if you look at statistics like non-oil trade or number of scientific journals published or women's literacy or any number of measures, you'll find that they lag way behind other regions. And I think this sort of arrested modernization or slower development has led to a discontent, which we saw in the Arab Spring, which is a misnomer, but it showed you one type of revolution of rising up from below. But in addition to that, there are other conflicts or revolutions going at the same time. You have concerns about the breakup of post-colonial states that were carved out of the Ottoman Empire. So if you look at Syria and Iraq today, it's not clear where those lines of those states are going to wind up being. And, or if you look at another conflict, which is the sectarian conflict between Sunni and Shia, which has become more intense. All these are happening at the same time, and they're leading to a sense of turmoil in the region, which I suspect will probably go on for 20 years or more. And the question is, can we do anything about it? And I think Iraq should have taught us the lesson that no, that essentially to go in and try to control this is a mistake. And therefore, what we have to do is try to contain it, to nudge it, to prevent it from spilling out too far. But the idea that the United States is going to be able to control what goes on inside these societies, I think is a self-deception. But it's also self-deception to think that anybody else from outside those areas is going to decide it. So I think if you say, does that make us less powerful or less influential than, let's say, 20 years ago, I think the answer is yes, we are less influential, but I don't think anybody else is more influential. It's just that in these revolutionary societies, power is diffused within, and it's not the central state structure as much as coming from below and from different groups, whether they be the populace or whether it be transnational terrorist groups and so forth. So I think that's the answer to your question is yes, we are less influential in the Middle East, but I think we should expect that to continue for another generation, and we shouldn't expect that, for example, China or anybody else is going to be replacing us. There's a question on the back row.
Hi, my name is Melody. I'm also with the class of 2015. So one of the biggest problems that China is facing domestically is the wealth disparity and the widening income gap. So I was just wondering what your views on that were in terms of China's future growth and stability in the economy on like the international level, and how that could affect the U.S. economy and growth as well.
Well, it's interesting because we actually benefit, we the United States actually benefit from a strong Chinese economy. In other words, economic growth is not a zero-sum game. And when China does well, it helps the rest of the world economy, including the United States. Now, that's an exaggeration, it's a gross calculation, because you can say particular industries or particular people or groups may lose in the competition. But overall, we should not want China to collapse. It would create much more harm to us than gain. Will China collapse? Will political instability lead to problems? I don't know. I mean, I don't think Xi Jinping knows. And one of the things that you're seeing right now is a tremendous crackdown in China because of uncertainty about the political situation. I was in Beijing in December, and we have a dialogue that we have with the Central Party School. I think Madeleine was with us on this group. And I talked to a friend of mine who I've seen over the years, and he said, I have to be careful what I say now. And you know, a couple of years ago, you would speak quite frankly, and it wasn't a problem. So the anti-corruption campaign, which Xi Jinping is using, is partly to stamp out corruption, though it won't, but it's also partly to punish his enemies, and it's creating a pretty broad sense of fear. Whether that will actually lead to the kind of turmoil that would disrupt Chinese economic growth, I'm not sure. I think probably not. I think it'll disrupt Chinese political development. I think it sets back the kinds of things that Wen Jiabao used to talk about of gradual democratization and so forth. I don't think it's going to lead to another Tiananmen. But that's not, I mean, if you look at the minds of the top leaders, they are worried about the possibility of another Tiananmen. And I think that is costly for China. And I think that will, in fact, have some effects on growth of slowing it, though not stopping it. But as I said, you're just hearing me give guesses, but I don't know that anybody has a better guess, including Xi Jinping. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Barrett. I'm class of 15. And I'm going to, ask you to make another guess. So oil is, of course, going to continue to be one of the most important resources in the coming years. And the U.S. has had a very, very long-term investment in African oil. And there's been this huge rise recently in Chinese investment in this oil and Chinese investment in infrastructure in Africa in several different sectors. And there's sort of this debate over whether China is going to be a partner with us in working with deals in Africa or whether China is a rival. And I was wondering what you think about whether we should be worried about China's greater investment in oil and other infrastructure or whether that's a good thing for us.
Well, I don't worry about it, but it doesn't mean I'm right, but at least it tells you what I think. I think the Americans are going to be less dependent upon imported oil anyway. And I think that China is going to increase its dependence on imported oil. And there are cases where there is a rivalry. Companies have rivalries in particular fields. There are also cases where, for example, when the American oil companies had to pull out of Sudan in the 90s, because of human rights concerns, Chinese were happy to run right in. Human rights wasn't a problem at all. So there's a case where China did replace the U.S., but partly because we took ourselves out of the game. So there can be conflicts on particulars, and there may be situations where there'll be some firms which will try to push the U.S. government to say this Chinese are taking this block in Angola that we wanted and so forth. I don't think it, from a larger perspective, 30,000-foot level, I don't think it matters all that much. Oil markets are fungible, and the Chinese bringing it out, and if the U.S. has plenty of oil of its own, I don't see it as being a great problem. There are people who make a profession, however, out of saying that there's going to be a resource scarcity and we and the Chinese are going to be head-to-head in conflict over natural resources, particularly oil. And this is where the conflict is going to rise. To me, I don't see it, but for the reasons that I gave. If you want, what worries me more is a different dimension of oil, which is after you burn it, what happens to the CO2? And there, I think there's more of a question and more of a problem. I mean, the one area where China is clearly a superpower is production of CO2. They produce much more than we do. Not historically integrated, but I'm just saying at the margins now. And it was interesting to see that Obama and Xi Jinping reached an agreement last fall, which some people say was inadequate to deal seriously with CO2, but which at least showed that the Chinese and the Americans would work together to try to set the idea of certain limits on CO2 production. So it's not the inputs of oil, it's the outputs of oil that worry me. Yes, here in front.
Hi, I'm Erica. I'm the class of 2018. And my question also kind of relates to economy and how, do you think that how do you think the U.S. should respond or interpret China's attempt to create somewhat of a World Bank in kind of the Asian region, and what you think that means for our leaders?
Well, there is a new institution that China's creating called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the United States opposed it. I think it was a really dumb decision by the United States to oppose it. If China wants to recirculate some of its massive holdings of surplus currency into infrastructure funds for other countries, that's a good thing. What you don't want is for that to be a corrupt slush fund but the extent to which you get other countries involved so that it has to be institutionalized and have a degree of transparency, that's a good thing. So opposing it was, I think, to my mind, dumb. And President Obama last Tuesday at his press conference with Prime Minister Abe in Washington said that the United States thought that getting some of these Chinese funds out to other countries made sense, and that the United States was going to look at this with a less jaundiced eye in the future. It's just too bad we took so long to get there.
Okay, I'm Shannon Kearney. I'm a class of 2018, and speaking about like Prime Minister Abe and stuff, I'm interested in Japanese relations with the U.S. And you said that China doesn't pose a significant threat like to the U.S. right now, but through like Japan is a significant military ally with the U.S. and I think the U.S. has an agreement to protect Japan if China were to say like take over the islands. Like there's an island dispute. How do you think that will play out? And in the future, I know the U.S.'s relations with China are also influenced by China's economic growth, and if perhaps the U.S. would favor that over its relations with Japan, and how that might play out in the future.
Well, it's an interesting question. I'll give you a little history on it to answer it. Well, I was in the Pentagon in the Clinton administration in the 90s. And at that time, we could see that China was rising. The question is, what did you do about it? Some people say, well, the thing you should do about it is try to contain them, hold them back, because they're going to be a threat in the future. That would have been a pretty dumb policy, because most other Asian nations didn't want us to try to contain China. They wanted to trade with China and thought that this was not something they wanted to join in. The other thing is, if we had tried to contain China, hold them back, you would have had a guaranteed enemy in the future. And we don't know whether you'd have a friend or an enemy in the future, but to throw away all the prospects that you don't have an enemy was not a very smart policy either. But then people would say, well, yes, but if you do this, if you bring China in to the World Trade Organization, they accept all their trade and so forth, and then they get powerful, they get rich and powerful, and then they turn out to be a bully, what are you going to do? It's too late. You've made the mistake. And so we devised a policy in which we said, let's take out an insurance policy. And our insurance policy was to reaffirm the US-Japan Security Treaty, which had been in force since 1960, but which many people thought was a relic of the Cold War and we should just abandon it. And we came to the decision that, no, our policy toward East Asia was going to be integrate China, but take out an insurance policy by reaffirming the security relationship with Japan. And that essentially is what we've had since Clinton and Hashimoto made a declaration in '96 saying that the US-Japan Security Treaty was the basis for stability in East Asia. That survived through the Bush 43 administration. It's in the Obama administration. And I was interested, I went to the White House last Tuesday for the state dinner for Prime Minister Abe, and I was struck at how effusive both Japan and US were in praising this alliance, which 20 years ago had been on the rocks, but had been reaffirmed. And the argument is that if China does become a bully, it tries to push its neighbors as it becomes more powerful, then essentially there is a way to push back by using the normal balance of power that exists in East Asia. But if China doesn't act as a bully, then there's no reason that this treaty should be a threat to China. The problem is going to come up if you have something like the Senkaku or Diaoyu Island, Senkaku in Japanese, Diaoyu in Chinese. And there, what happened is that in the United States has said that they are covered by the US-Japan Security Treaty, that we don't take a position on whether they were ultimately in the 19th century Chinese or Japanese, that they should solve that in a court somewhere. but that when we handed back Okinawa to Japan in 1972, we had taken Okinawa obviously in World War II. When we handed it back, it included the Senkaku Islands. Therefore, Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty covered the islands. So we basically have said to China, don't try to take these by force, because it will invoke the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. We've also said to Japan, try to calm this, cool it, put it off to the next generation. This is not an issue that has to be solved in the short run. So we're trying to, in the largest picture, have integration of China, meaning that rather than containing it, we're accepting Chinese trade, Chinese students. We want full integration, but we have an insurance policy, which is the treaty with Japan, just in case. And on the particular point that it might lead to friction that you mentioned, the islands in the East China Sea, we've been trying to persuade both Japan and China that trying to resolve the sovereignty issue in the short run is not going to be very effective. The best thing to do is just put it off for another generation.
One last question.
Okay. One last question.
Nora Edie, class of 2015. Thank you very much. I wanted to come back to the question of oil that Barrett brought up. And you touched on the recent oil boom in the U.S. And my question is, do you think it's time to lift the oil export ban that has been in place since the 1970s, roughly, the time of the energy crisis and the oil embargoes?
Yes, I do. That ban on export of oil was at a time when our dependence on imported oil was increasing. You had the period after the Arab oil embargo when everybody was worried about this. And the idea was save the oil for Americans. It was sometimes jokingly called drain America first, which is another way of looking at it. But I think it's unnecessary and now and unwise. We ought to be essentially opening the markets. What it does now is it leads to you can export refined products. So it means that we tend to subsidize the use of oil and export refined products. And I don't think that makes an awful lot of sense. So I think this is a piece of legislation that should be changed, though in populist terms, when you have to stand up in front of a crowd that's about to vote for you and you say, we're going to give away this oil to the foreigners, it's hard, but I still think that it makes more sense to open the markets.
Thank you, Nai, for coming out.
Thank you.